Thanks everyone at CAFS and Becky. Hello, I'm Tim. Welcome to our webinar on the Farm Carbon Toolkit with Becky Wilson. A few things for this afternoon's webinar. Thanks for joining. I can see there's 19 participants and some of us panelists behind the scenes. We can't see you at the moment, but the session's being recorded for those people who can't, and then that will be published later. We're going to show you a couple of slides, and then Becky's going to start on the presentation today. If you would like to introduce yourself, please feel welcome to. You could do that in the chat function, and then on the bottom next to chat there's a Q&A box. We've got a question and answer session later, so as Becky's talking, if you wish to ask a question, please feel free to put that in there then, and then we'll come around to asking those. Later on in the session, we want to have a bit of reflection and discussion, so we're going to work out how we're going to do that, but it'd be really interesting to hear your reflections. And again, if you could put those, say, in the question box, that would be useful towards the end for us to start to collect some of those things. We want to take some of that awareness and things we're learning this afternoon away, ready for our next farming and land use sector group. Which reminds me, I haven't told you my role in this. Today I'm chairing the webinar, and I'm the convener, so I chair the farming and land use sector for ZCC group. Okay, I think that's enough from me in terms of the housekeeping and stuff. Well, we welcome Becky, and thank you for your time this afternoon, coming to talk to us about your role and what you do at the Farm Carbon Toolkit. I understand you're going to be talking for about 30, 40 minutes or so, and then at the end of that then I'll come back and we'll take some questions from the question and answer function on the webinar.
Brilliant. So yes, it's lovely to be here with you this afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me along. My name's Becky, and I work for an organisation called the Farm Carbon Toolkit. I'll explain a little bit more about what we do as we go through. But certainly what I'm going to talk to you about this afternoon is some of the work that we've been doing and how that feeds into thinking about the role that farming and land use plays in terms of achieving those net zero goals, in terms of how understanding the way that we farm and actually how that land is managed can help contributing to things like carbon sequestration and those bits. And some of the work and the data that I'll be going through is stuff that we've been spending our time doing over the last few years, really starting to try and dig out some of the answers around the sort of the potential for soil carbon sequestration, which we know is that unique ability for farmers to contribute to some of these things that we might be thinking about. So that's where we're going to sort of start today. Just then, in terms of, for anybody that doesn't know about the Farm Carbon Toolkit, we are a farmer-led organisation. We were set up back in 2008 to really try and provide practical tools and resources for farmers around reducing greenhouse gas emissions, improving energy resilience, improving soil health, and how that feeds through to helping support thriving, resilient businesses which are doing brilliant things in terms of both climate action and also promoting nature positive businesses. So we are farmer-led. So we were set up by two farmers who really thought that after the advent of the Climate Change Act, there was lots of information about why farmers should reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. But there was very little out there that said, well, okay, I'm a farmer. I want to know what I can do. What are those practical things that I can do? And as I say, that's very much where we've sort of come from. And over the last, sort of 12 years, we've really tried to develop a suite of resources and projects and support that farmers can access that help them understand practically what those things are that they can do. And fundamentally, we work with farmers. And we work with farmers in three sort of key areas, two of which are very much what I'm going to talk to you guys about today. One of very much in the centre of what we're going to be talking about is our work that we do to measure. And a key part of that is actually our carbon calculator that allows you to calculate and understand what's going on in terms of the carbon footprint of a farm, understanding and quantifying those areas on the farm which are generating greenhouse gas emissions, but then on the other side thinking about where those farms or where those landscapes might be holding greenhouse gas emissions, specifically around carbon. So the calculator is one of our main resources that we have, but we also spend a lot of time thinking about how we can quantify the amount of carbon that is being held on farm. And so we have our soil carbon project, which I'll be talking to you about in a little bit more detail, which allows us to understand how we measure, monitor and manage soil carbon as we move forward. So measurement is a key part of what we do. I'm often to be found down a hole looking at what's happening from a soil health or a carbon perspective. But with all of these sort of things, measurement is incredibly important, but it's only really that first step. And so we also then do that next bit, which is actually saying, well, okay, we've got a number, but what does that number actually mean? And actually helping support farmers to make those changes that will both reduce greenhouse gas emissions and improve soil health. And so there's a couple of examples there of projects that we have on. So we have a farm net zero project, which aims to really showcase and champion the abilities that farmers have to contribute positively towards net zero. So that's happening at the moment in Cornwall, so a little bit far away from you guys. But we have 3 demonstration farms with a challenge of getting them to net zero by the end of 2025, and they're all well on the way to doing that at the moment. We then have a network of 40 monitor farms, and across those 40 monitor farms, the aim is for them to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 30% over those 5 years and also reduce their costs of production. And then we do a range of work outside of farming, helping to communicate those things that they're doing and help enter into those sort of conversations. So very much measurement is a key part of it, but also then the so what? Well, actually, what can we do with that information? What does that tell us in terms of helping to formulate those businesses which are actually putting themselves on the front foot in terms of dealing with those challenges that we've got coming down the line? But then also that bit around actually communicating it and challenging it outside of our individual sectors. So although we work with individual farms, we also work across with farming groups, with farming clusters, across supply chains, to actually sort of start to communicate the good stuff that's going on farm more widely. So whether that be with non-farming audiences, whether that be with, with groups, with policymakers, all those sorts of things, to just try and help people to understand what is happening on farm and what the abilities are for farmers to contribute positively to some of these policy ambitions, be it net zero, be it nature friendly, all these other things that are going on. So how do we start to use the data, gather the good news stories that are happening on the farm, and actually start to communicate those much more widely? So that's who we are. Let's think then about this idea around soil carbon. And, what we know is that it's a really fast moving area. And you can basically, on a quick Google search, you can find people or organizations or position statements that will say that actually, in order to sequester carbon, this ability we have in terms of how we manage our land to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and hold it across our landscapes. And we will have that complete range of sort of points of view which say that the only way that we are able to increase carbon sequestration is by planting trees. Or we have at the other end, which we say, well, actually, if we could improve the carbon content of all of the world's soils by 0.04% per year, we would solve climate change. And there's a range of sort of opinions and perspectives from one extreme to the other. You can see that data there in terms of the NFU net zero strategy, which says that actually enhancing soil carbon storage could deliver those greenhouse gas savings of 5 megatons of carbon dioxide per year. We know that obviously it's becoming quite an important thing in terms of outside of those farming sectors, in terms of the ability for farming to also help decarbonize other sectors that don't have that ability to be able to also do that positive thing. So there's a huge amount of activity going on in this area at the moment, whether it's the development of carbon markets and the opportunities for farmers or groups of farmers to engage with other sectors, whether it's thinking about actually what does this mean in terms of how we are going to manage our landscapes moving forward, but also what are those practices that farmers can potentially be doing and what's possible. We also know that it is complicated because we're not just dealing with one sort of type of soil. Each farm is unique. Each farm is a unique combination of what's under the ground in terms of its soil type, what falls out the sky, and then what that farmer does in the middle. So it's not like we've got a nice spreadsheet that basically says if we do this practice, this will be what happens. It's very much dependent, and that adds to the complexity and the difficulty in terms of having a very clear, coherent strategy in terms of where we're going. But undaunted by that complexity, we shall continue. So what are the sort of key accounting challenges that we have when we think about managing soil carbon, and how does this sort of influence what might be going on at a farm level? Well, we know that we've got a lot of supply chains that are now starting to make those net zero pledges. We will be net zero by whichever date they're putting in there. But at the moment, that the metrics that they're using to actually don't give them the data that they need. So if we look at some of the carbon footprinting that has historically been done through supply chains that have involved farming, be it down through milk processors or through supermarkets in terms of beef and lamb or other bits and pieces, historically those metrics or those models that have been used have only been assessing what's going on in terms of emissions intensity. So the amount of greenhouse gas emission that has been produced per kilo of product. There has been no account taken of any of the good stuff that's happened as part of that process. So there hasn't been any account of how much carbon is held across landscapes, across hedgerows, across environmental areas, as well as what's happening within the soil. So the challenge then becomes for these supply chains, actually, how are they able to reach net zero if they're not accounting for and they're not developing those metrics that actually allow them to measure the good stuff that's going on, as well as where those greenhouse gas emissions are coming from. Another challenge we have is that there is this move to use the model-based systems. The problem that we have is that when we have mixed farming systems or we have livestock-based farming systems, those models just don't work. So we've seen that there is that development of some of these models that are specifically focused for arable farming enterprises, where we can see that the reduction in cultivation or the inclusion of cover crops or other bits and pieces, they can account for some carbon sequestration through those practices. But they're very much designed for cereal cropping enterprises. If you start to try and add mixed farming systems or predominantly livestock farming systems into those models, the computers just explode. They can't cope with the complexity of what's required. So again, we then come to the point of, well, if we're in a mixed farming system or a livestock farming system, actually we need some data or some measurements to be able to show what's happening, because we can't achieve a lot of that through the use of a model. What we also know is, as I said earlier, we have a range of farmers who are actually achieving really good things in terms of enhanced carbon sequestration. And at the moment, traditionally, the models that are used in terms of calculators don't actually include a lot of that within it. So they're not being seen as being rewarded for the good practices that they might be doing. And that may well be around how they're managing their grasslands, what they're doing in terms of stock and grazing practices. It might be what they're doing in terms of that integration with other environmental areas. All of those things that are going on have been sort of going on, arguably unrecognized through current metrics up to date. But there's also about thinking about it at that individual farm level in terms of how do we start to pull this all together, is that understanding that actually if we're focusing on soil health, then actually other good things happen as well. Our soil is our most important asset as a farm. And actually, if we can manage that in a way which is delivering improved sequestration, it will also start to help build the resilience of that farm. So we will hold more water, we will cycle more nutrients, we will support more biodiversity, all the things which we want to happen as part of these resilient, thriving landscapes that we are that we're trying to sort of protect and enhance as we move forward. So starting by thinking about how do we actually better account for what's happening. We know there's really good stuff going on. We know that there are all these ideas and things which could happen in terms of understanding and quantifying the benefits of how we're managing our landscape. We're just missing the data to be able to show what's going on. And that's very much where we've been sort of working over the last few years. So we've very much been focused on trying to look at how we measure soil carbon sequestration. And that's very much been happening since about 2017. And it really came about because we have a project which is called Soil Farmer of the Year. And basically, that is a competition that opens each year on World Soils Day and really aims to champion and promote those farmers who are doing brilliant things around sustainable soils management. And what we do is the sort of top 3 farmers that get recognised from that competition all hold a farm walk. And they're always fantastic opportunities, really good learnings. You know, we just let the farmer lead them and they just take us and show us what they want to show us. And what we were finding in those first couple of years was that we would have these farm walks and we would go around these incredible farms with farmers that were transforming their businesses. They were doing incredible things. And we'd go out and they'd say, look, you know, look, my system has changed. You know, I am managing to, you know, do whatever they're doing, less inputs, you know, better performance, improved resilience. And my question always back to them would be like, it looks incredible. Did you take any baseline data before you started? So have we got any data that says, actually, before I did all this sort of stuff, my soil health was this, and now it's this? And the question that I would always get, or the answer that I'd always get back was no. And when I sort of say, well, why not? And they say, well, we didn't really know what to test for. We weren't massively convinced that some of the analysis or the tests that were there at the time were particularly useful. And it's always the last thing that we just forgot to do. So we sort of built the Soil Carbon Project to really answer a couple of key questions. And at the same time as doing that sort of Soil Farmer of the Year, what I was also doing was going out and doing talks a little bit like this, and the questions would come at the end, right, well, I'm rotational grazing. How much carbon is that sequestering me? Or I just planted a herbal ley. How much carbon is that sequestering me? Or actually, I'm starting to think about incorporating grass within some of my arable rotation. What's that going to do in terms of improving my carbon sequestration? And the answer that I would often have to give them is, well, it depends. And it's such a horrible answer to have to give anybody, because what you want is you want to sort of be able to give somebody something that helps them realize that what they're doing is moving in the right direction. So for the Soil Carbon Project, what we really started to look at was to answer 3 key questions. Number 1, how do we test for soil carbon? Is it just as simple as doing an organic carbon analysis? Is it organic matter? How deep do we need to test? How many samples do we need to take? What time of the year do we need to test them? How does it link through to soil health? Really trying to nail and understand what's going on from that testing process, so that hopefully we can not only inspire confidence within farmers that actually there is a robust way of testing which is cost effective, but also then for our policymakers, for other interested groups, we can start to provide a bit of robustness in terms of how we start to measure these things across farms and across landscapes. The second sort of main point of it was to say, well, once we've worked out how we can test for it, actually, what are those practices that are making a difference? So when I start getting asked those questions about, well, what about this? What about if I did this? We can actually start to say, well, actually, if you test, that's really good, but we're getting this sort of figure in terms of it's moving in the right direction. And then the final thing was to say, well, actually, how does this all come together? So if we're then thinking about actually what are those practices that both build soil health, improve soil carbon, and also reduce greenhouse gas emissions? So what is that bit around bringing it all back together to thinking about the impact on the carbon footprint? And so that was very much what we sort of set out to do in terms of our soil carbon project. Because we know that actually, in order to start to have a much more informed conversation, we should have been testing this stuff 20 years ago. If we'd have started sort of thinking about actually what are the things that we need to test, getting this data collected, then we absolutely would not be in the position that we're in now, because we'd have really good understanding of what's possible in terms of that change over time. And a lot of those farmers who have been doing lots of really good things for the last sort of 20 years would have that data there so that we could start to have a much more informed debate. But we didn't have that data. So the next best time to start thinking about this is now. So where do we start, and how do we start to collect all that sort of information together? And that was very much our question at the start, in terms of, so what do we test? What might we need to test for? And how can we do this in a cost-effective and time-effective manner? So what have we been doing? Well, we've been digging a lot of holes and taking a lot of samples, but our basic core methodology is that for each field, we test a range of different parameters. So we're testing nutrients and pH, both in terms of obviously pH and then a basic nutrients in terms of pK-mag, to be able to provide that sort of baseline from a chemical perspective. Each field is then also tested for both soil organic matter and soil organic carbon, so that we can understand what's there in each of those fields in terms of the organic matter fraction, which obviously includes the biology, but then we've also got that carbon fraction within that soil as well. And each of those fields is tested at 3 depths. So really important to understand not just how much carbon there is, but where that carbon is at different depths. And that will become in a minute when I show you some data, actually why that's important. So we test at 0 to 10 centimetres, 10 to 30 centimetres, and then 30 to 50 centimetres, if there is that much soil. Now, there are occasions where obviously you're hitting rock before that, but if we do have that amount of soil, then that's what we're testing to. And what we're doing is we're testing 15 GPS log points across the field, and all of those mean that we can then revisit those same points when we come back and do retesting. All of those samples are taken using an auger, so that we can look at what's happening at different depths. And what we're also doing is, obviously, as I say, all of that is then mapped spatially, so that we can then look at this across landscapes, across habitats, but also make sure that when we go back and do the retesting, we're visiting exactly the same points in the field. At the same point, as well as looking at soil carbon and soil organic matter, we're also really interested in looking at soil health, because we know that soil carbon and sequestration happens slowly, okay? But soil health and those things which actually potentially have a wider role in terms of thinking about, you know, habitat performance, all those other sorts of natural capital benefits can change more quickly. So we're also then in each of those fields, we're digging 3 points, and we're looking at things like soil structure. So how our soil is put together, what the architecture is like, does it have the right amount of air and water within it? We're also then looking at worms as an indicator of biological activity. We're looking at aggregate stability, so the stability of that soil, which is really inherently linked to the carbon content, but also to its water holding capacity and its ability to contribute to natural flood management. And then we're also looking at bulk density. So again, taking 3 samples at those different depths to be able to calculate the carbon yield and the carbon stock across the field. And again, all of that is also recorded, and each of the participating farms and fields has all of that reported back to them in a soil report. So what have we done in terms of our numbers? So as I say, we started sampling for this project in 2018, the beginning of 2018. The initial cohort of farms that we took through it, we had 28 farms nationally that were our sort of first pilot group that we took through. We then managed to expand the project due to some funding that we were able to access in Cornwall. So we had another 55 that joined in the southwest, and that gave us a mix of arable, grassland, horticultural fields that we could actually start to use as a baseline. So those farms have been through a process where they've been sampled every year for the first 5 years of that project. We've also then had a couple of sort of offshoots from that project as well. So we had a really intensively managed replicated trial, which was looking at management. So there were 150 sample sites across one farm, looking at the impact of different opportunities for arable systems. So looking at actually high biomass cover crops, incorporating residues versus not incorporating residues, and also the impacts of having diverse grazing lays in an arable rotation. So that was a very sort of highly replicated, more research trial setup that was also done as part of it. We also then linked in, again with the same protocol, to a different research project that was going on in Cornwall that was very much looking at the impact of planting more multi-species swards. So again, before and after with controls and all those sorts of things. In February 2021, we also started work with Yo Valley. So we expanded our network, and we had 27 farms that were all supplying into Yo Valley, so all organic dairy farmers. And rather than for the rest of the farms, where we took a sample of fields, for that Yo Valley project, we sampled every single field on every single farm to provide a really accurate baseline, which we will then go back and revisit in year 5. So there's almost over 1,100 fields there, and over 6,000 hectares. And what we've tried to do, as well as those things that I've highlighted there, we have also been really keen all the way through to be open and transparent with our methodology. So although unfortunately we haven't got huge amounts more funding to bring loads of people in to have all this done for them without any cost, if other people want to set up their projects, we've encouraged them to use the same methodology, so that we're pooling together all this great amount of data to be able to start to sort of fill in the gaps as to what's possible from a management perspective. We've also, as I say, been doing a lot of other projects that have been involved, and any soil sampling that we do all follows that same methodology. So again, all of that can feed into looking at what's possible. So that's great. We've dug lots of holes, we've counted lots of worms, we've sent huge numbers of bags of soil off to the lab to be analysed. But what does it mean? And that's the really important bit in terms of thinking about the so what next? How can we start to use some of this data to actually inform how our land is being managed, how that fits in terms of balancing carbon sequestration with natural capital, with all these other sorts of things? Well, just in terms of some headline results, and it's all fairly positive. We can measure soil carbon. People will tell you it's very complicated. It can be very complicated. But there are also protocols and ways that you can do it, which give you data, which allows you to provide that level of robustness behind it, and actually doesn't have to mean that you spend from now until Christmas taking samples. What we've also found is that farmers can build soil carbon. So again, if we go back to that slide right at the beginning around actually, is there any opportunity for farmers to build carbon and continue to build carbon? We can see that yes, there is. So there's another positive. So it's not a case of saying that actually any existing farmland is already at its maximum sequestration and the only alternative there is to introduce more biomass. There is an opportunity to improve that soil carbon. But the really important bit is that how that land is managed is the important bit. So it's not just about saying this field is grass, this field is growing wheat, therefore actually in order to make this wheat field sequester more carbon, we need to turn it into a grass field. It's actually how those fields are being managed, what's happening in terms of how those farmers are using their stock, their rotations, all those other sorts of things to actually manage to improve that carbon sequestration, which is really important. And it's also important to actually then do that bit, which is understanding actually what are those activities contributing, both from a sequestration perspective, but also on the other side, from a reducing emissions perspective. So where are those balances in terms of those practices or those things that we might be recommending, which will help in terms of reducing that farm's greenhouse gas emissions, and at the same time, also helping in terms of building sequestration. So again, some sort of headline results broken down into different farming systems. So what we know and what we knew before, but we sort of had to go through that process to find out, is that actually testing fields every year is inherently noisy and actually gives you get very overexcited that everything's brilliant, and then you get very depressed when it all moves. So annual sampling is absolutely not the way to go for carbon and organic matter. What we want to be doing is we want to be testing that every 3 to 5 years, ideally every 5 years. But if you're very impatient and you want to know what's going on, you can go back in year 3, but you might have to just take the results with a bit of a pinch of salt. So, don't test it year on year. We had some fields where we were testing them every month to look at that variation throughout the year. And as you would expect, because we're dealing with complex biological systems that are inherently linked to that carbon and nitrogen cycle, the organic matter and the organic carbon will vary throughout the year. What we have found is that actually the years since ploughing does seem to have a significant impact on an arable system. So again, we know that obviously when those fields are turned over, when you cultivate those fields, that sudden flush of oxygen which goes into the soil stimulates those soil microbes which start respiring. A byproduct of that respiration is carbon dioxide, which goes off. We've been starting to do a little bit of work in terms of understanding the impact of cover crops. We've got fairly mixed results depending on which soil type we're looking at and what cover crop species are in there. Again, the devil very much is in the detail. So not all cover crops are created equal. So understanding what the variation of species are within there and actually what they're doing, both in terms of a rooting depth, how long they're there, how they're being established, what's happening in terms of termination. All of those things very much feed into the analysis. We have found that actually if we've got a sort of no-till system and we've got cover crops, that does seem to be having a positive impact. But again, depth of where that impact is happening is really important. It comes back to this idea of it's not just about saying we're just focusing on what's going on in the top couple of inches of soil. It's understanding where that carbon is stored throughout the soil profile is incredibly important. From a grassland perspective, again, lots of different things that we've picked out, but we know broadly diversity is important. So actually making sure that we've got a diversity of rooting activities going on, which is doing different things in terms of depth, really important. Again, grazing management also seems to be incredibly important. So thinking about not just the amount of times that those animals are on that field, but also that rest period, and starting to think about moving to sort of transitioning to those more rotational grazing systems. It's not saying that actually we need to actually all move to, mob stocking and those sorts of things. We know there is an increasing variation in terms of those options, but we know that has an impact. The other really interesting thing that we found is that there was an impact depending on where we had fields which were grass fields, which were just silage fields. There was no animal impact there, and those fields which were grazing fields. And over the piece, we tended to find that those grass fields which had that animal impact had a higher carbon content. So again, we know there's that sort of golden hoof effect about the fact that actually those animals being on that grassland in terms of what they're providing in terms of organic manures, but also that process of grazing, that trampling, eating the grass, actually that was really contributing in terms of that carbon cycle and helping to feed more carbon into the system. And where we've got fields which are exactly the same soil type next to each other, and one is a sort of zero graze system where it's mowed, and another one where the stock are in there grazing, The ones where the stock were in there grazing had a higher carbon stock than the ones that didn't. So again, just really reinforcing the importance of those animals to be there doing that job in terms of actually turning that grass into something that we can do something with. Now, this is some work that we've done looking at categorizing it depending on land use type. And this is, again, we can see a couple of different things here. So we can see how we've categorized them in terms of crop type. So again, we've got fields that are in an arable rotation, fields which are in horticulture, fields which are under woodland, and this is actually the cohort that we've done through the Yo Valley project. So where we did have some fields that were also in woodland, some areas of farms which were in woodland that we tested again to be able to provide that control. Diverse lays, temporary grass, and then permanent pasture. And what we can see here is again that percentage soil organic matter at those 3 different depths. Okay, so we can see obviously 0 to 10, 10 to 30, and 30 to 50. And as you would expect, as you go down the soil profile, the amount of soil organic matter goes down. But what you also find is the stability of that organic matter is much higher. So it's a bit like thinking about your current account in terms of your bank account and your savings account. We've got lots of activity, lots of transactions going in and out in terms of that topsoil. We've got much more stable, hopefully growing slowly over time, like your savings as you go down. Now, what was really interesting here is that actually, when we looked at the soil organic matter percentage, we found that actually our diverse lays were performing really, really well against not just our temporary grassland and our permanent pasture, which arguably, if we think about it from from a logical perspective, obviously that's not been disturbed, so that's should have the highest carbon stock. Actually, we started to find that some of these fields that had a little bit more diversity in them were actually performing better, and they were also performing better than some of those more perennial features as well. If we then turn that into carbon yield, so again, this is then thinking about not just a percentage organic matter or organic carbon, but actually then combining that with the depth of the soil and also that bulk density to give you a carbon stock. So this is tons of carbon per hectare. Again, we can see the difference there between the different land use types. So we can see arable, as you would expect, where again, we've got a little bit more cultivation and a disturbance going on. Moving then through in terms of looking at those different land use types. And again, we can see that diversity there that's really performing well. And where they're really performing well is in that 10 to 30 centimetres. So again, this idea that if we've got species and we're introducing those species or they're there already, deeper rooting, actually it's that next level down where we're starting to get that improved sequestration. Another way to think about it is that, again, we can look at it by land use type. But actually, this is an example here of a farm. So these are all the fields on this farm that have been looked at. Now, the total carbon stock, so the tons of carbon that this farm is holding on to across that farm to 50 centimetres is a big bonkers number, 68,000 tonnes. Amazing. The average carbon stock per hectare is just under 200 tonnes. That's really, really good. But what's really interesting is then when you put all those onto the graph there, actually you can see the variation. And you then have to ask the question, well, what is causing that variation? And obviously some of that variation may well be due to the fact that we have a different soil type across the farm. Some of that variation may well be due to the fact that actually, you might be growing a different crop in that farm, in that field. But a lot of that is actually down to management. And that's where you can then start to see is that it's not just about the total carbon, but how much carbon is there. So again, there's that same farm example there where we then split it out to different depths. So we can start to see how much carbon is at those different depths. And we can then start to use this to think about that modeling to say, well, actually, oh, no, I'm sorry, I thought I had another slide there. To say actually where we can then where we can control out the soil type and management system, actually, what is causing that variation and where are the fields that we might want to target to improve carbon to actually get those fields to perform particularly well. So that's some of the things that we can start to pull out of the data. Really important to understand that, actually within those sort of land use types, we can see that actually some of those grassland systems are performing incredibly well, but also understanding that in-field variation and the ability to change. So what? So I can show you a lot of nice, pretty grass, but what does it actually mean? Because that management bit is a critical part of that what next discussion. So it allows us to look at actually what is the impact of that current management to assess variation. So again, we're still doing some analysis because it takes a few years worth of data to come through, and that analysis is a constantly evolving process to do that, which will allow us to sort of have a complete set of analysis. But let's just show you some case studies in terms of to illustrate the potential. So these case studies come from, as I say, the work that we've been doing in terms of providing that baseline for Yeo Valley. Now, those Yeo Valley farms were all across, they weren't just in the southwest, they're all across the UK. But because we've got that complete baseline across all of their farms, we can then start to control for some of these underlying factors. So again, what happens in terms of that within field variation? So these are the fields on one of the farm examples that are all the same soil type. So you could say, well, okay, what's causing that difference? Well, we can see that some of them are permanent pasture and some of them are temporary grasslands. So some of those will have had a reseed at some point. But we can still see within that actually, you know, there isn't much of a relationship there just based on perennial nature of that grassland. If we can then combine that with the soil health metrics, we can see that if we could get those temporary grassland fields to perform like that top temporary grassland field, over 5 years, we would be sequestering an additional 70 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent per hectare. Now that's bonkers figures. That's way beyond what we might be modelling for thinking about some of those other more dramatic things. If we said, well, actually, let's go down, let's not be massively optimistic, let's curb our excitement and go to that next one, it's still then, again, producing a really big benefit in terms of 10 tonnes of carbon dioxide a hectare. So again, nothing to be sniffed at. Let's look at a couple of those management examples in a little bit more detail. So this is the impact of improving diversity. And this is, again, a split field trial where half of the field was sown to perennial ryegrass and white clover. Half of it had a diverse mix. Now, by a diverse mix here, I'm not meaning a 63 species all singing or dancing. It costs a huge amount. This has just got 6 species in it, okay? It's got, again, your ryegrass, your clover, and then it's got some other bits and pieces in there in terms of additional legumes and herbs and those sorts of things. Same soil type, same previous rotation, everything else is the same. Both of those lays were established in spring 2019, and then they were grazed in 2020 and 2021. And what you can see there is you can see the difference in terms of soil organic matter percentage at 0 to 10 centimetres, 10 to 30 centimetres, and then 30 to 50 centimetres. And then what that equates to in terms of total carbon per hectare when we turn that into carbon stock. And this is why it's really important to actually look at what's going on to depth. Okay, because if we were doing what is often the case and what we would be advised to do in terms of just doing our soil sampling to that sort of 10 to 15 centimetres, which is what, you know, as I say, what we'd be doing if we were just doing it for a chemical analysis, you would say, well, okay, diverse mix has got a little bit more, but actually you could control for that out in terms of stats and it probably wouldn't be significant. But what's happening is that diversity is incorporating some of those deeper rooting species. And you can see that suddenly when we also look at what's happening at 10 to 30 centimetres, you've got a much more significant difference going on there. And what that equates to over that field is a difference of 37 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent per hectare. So again, this data is starting to show that actually there are abilities to change at a much higher rate than has often been thought. So let's look at a different example. So this again, because within the Yeo Valley project, for example, you know, it's an organic system. So in an organic system, there is potentially the chance where we might need to do some cultivation. Okay, so here again, we've got 2 fields which are exactly the same soil type. One which is perennial ryegrass white clover lay since 2010. One was reseeded after a ploughing event with a diverse mix in 2016. Okay, these were then tested and analysed in 2019. And what did we find? So again, we can see that perennial ryegrass white clover since 2010, carbon stock of about 49, just under 50 tonnes. That diverse mix, even though it's had that cultivation effect, is still sequestering more carbon because again, you've got that carbon going again in those deeper rooting species. So really important to think about our ability to start to make those changes. Grazing, impact of grazing. So again, thinking about the move to more rotational grazing. Now, by paddock grazing here, I do not mean that we have to go in with covers that you can't see the animals and actually you're moving them every 5 seconds. This is literally just a combination between set stop, where the animals are kept in the same place, and actually that move to more sort of rotational grazing. And again, we can see these dramatic differences that we can start to see there. So by having these measurements and by going through this process of doing all of these samples, we can actually start to now pull some really good data out that starts to show the possibility of how we can utilize stock grassland to actually start to deliver some of these climate benefits. Now, you could say, well, okay, that's just, that could not apply to us. Okay, some of those examples might have been on dairy systems and they might not work in beef or sheep or any of those sorts of things. As part of our Biodigested Carbon project, we've got similar data that works. What tends to happen, and one of the reasons why I put some of those dairy examples up, is often, when we start thinking about the ability to do things like mob graze and those sorts of things, often the criticism is, well, that won't work in a dairy system, or that won't work in my system. So what I tend to try and do is, by showing the data that we've got from the system where potentially it's hardest to make it work, we can then start to see that actually there are opportunities to make that work in systems where it's potentially a little bit more conventional. I'm mindful of time, so I shall carry up. We've been doing a lot of work also thinking about how we calculate carbon in uplands, and we've been really fortunate to have a pilot project working on a common over in the Lake District called Kinnerside to develop a new version of the calculator that allows us to account for carbon on commons, but also then start to think about actually how does that feed through in terms of how we do that allocation, and actually how we can make a better approximation of actually what's happening on upland farms. So there's been a huge amount of activity going on. And what that's leading to is that actually we have the ability to start to put that data into the calculator, and that calculator will be live very, very soon. What we did as part of that project was that we wanted to try and understand how much carbon was being held across the common. And we started by doing that, looking at what was available in terms of looking at model data and habitat maps that had been taken out. But at the same time, we were also doing some work down in Dartmoor, at the Dartmoor National Park Authority, looking to try and quantify what was going on in terms of carbon stock across a range of different habitats across the moors. So what that allowed us to do was actually to sort of use the soil sampling that we'd done on Dartmoor to actually see what the ability was to start to improve those habitat categories which had those sort of stock carbon values on. And just to show you, in terms of when we start to think about the impacts of grazing systems, specifically in the uplands, what do we know? Well, we know that those upland soils have obviously got a large amount of carbon that's stored within them. But actually, what impacts and what ability do we have to further improve that sequestration of those habitats? And what might be some of the risks or the ways that we're stopped by doing that in terms of thinking about current derogations or flexibility in terms of how we're managing those areas? So again, we then sort of started to think about, well, what do we not know? We sort of know a little bit about that carbon stock and different land use cover. We don't know a huge amount about the impacts of specific management practices on soil carbon stock in those upland areas. And also then, what does that mean in terms of potentially when we've got those wetter habitats where we might be also thinking about methane emissions and peatlands and all those sorts of things. So again, this was then some work that we'd done on Dartmoor where we said, well, okay, let's categorize it in terms of what is the underlying soil type. Let's then categorize it in terms of habitat. And then let's go out and actually take some samples to look at what we can find. And we can see here, so again, this is Dartmoor, and this is a range of different soil types, all with that habitat in terms of acid grassland. Okay, and we can see that the difference here runs from 10.8 on a Morton Hampstead up until 28 on a Crowdy in terms of percentage soil organic matter. Now, some of that difference is obviously down to that soil type, the amount of soil that's there in terms of the soil depth. But what also is leading to that difference is management. And so being able to tease out all of these different things and look about what are those things that we can action and we can do in terms of how we're managing these areas is incredibly important. So again, then thinking about, well, that's on our common area, that's on our common land. What can we do on our in-by land? And again, thinking about what might be some of the options there. So again, these are another couple of farm examples where we're looking at classifying their in-by in terms of thinking about that permanent grazing, semi-improved grassland near and semi-improved grassland that's a bit further away. And both of those semi-improved areas had been reseeded more than 7 years ago on that top farm example. On this bottom farm example, we can see that, again, we've got 2 different areas which are semi-improved. We can see that that first field has had that diverse species mix that's put in it. And that second field has had grass and some more native white clover that's in there. And again, we can see where that difference is coming across the different depths, as well as looking at what the impact is having on that bulk density as well, which is that massive soil. So what does that look like in terms of improved carbon sequestration? So again, you've got that sort of that first holding where they've done that a bit of reseeding. We're actually, again, we can see the difference there in terms of the change in soil organic matter. And we can see that actually they've got a 20% increase in that soil organic matter in the near field. And we can see that again in terms of that other one where they've got herbal lays in there, or herbal lays which are appropriate for upland environments. Again, we've got all of those different ways where we can now start to put some numbers on some of these things moving forward. Again, diversity. So we can go for some of the numbers in terms of what we've measured, but what we've also done when we've done a bit of a synthesis in terms of what's possible, multi-species swords or diverse swords can sequester, more carbon than just thinking about a ryegrass white clover lay. But we have to then refine those to the environment that we want to put them in. So again, if we are moving to more upland areas where we potentially have got lower pH soils, some of that diversity will then need to be refined to make sense to what we need. Again, trialing different options to see what works, but also remembering that even though the benefits will come from improved sequestration, we're also going to get those other benefits in terms of improved soil health, in terms of improved pollinators, reduction in nutrient leaching in terms of holding on to those nutrients, and then also livestock health in terms of reducing our reliance on anthelmintics and improving the livestock's ability to deal with worms. How do we do that? Well, again, different options in terms of thinking about overseeding or stitching in and getting those things through. So, apologies, that was a really quick whistle-stop tour through some of the stuff that we've been doing. There is lots of data, but if you think back to what I said right at the beginning, actually having that data allows us to be a little bit further forward. Now, it's not for every farm system. We have to start to unpick it and look at what we've got, but we need to start to look at how we can use that data to help inform how we manage our landscapes, how we can take account of the good stuff that's going on. Looking at change over time is really important. But as well as remembering that specifically where we've got those grassland environments and those grassland habitats, they will be holding a lot of carbon anyway. So how do we protect that existing carbon and see that ability to change? The models that have previously been used, we start to think actually probably are quite oversimplistic. So when we start to add in all these extra complexities of livestock, all these other bits, how do we actually get something that makes sense? Grazing livestock are part of the system. But we need to continue to develop that evidence and also flexibility in terms of how we manage those landscapes to optimize the benefits. What's really interesting is sometimes when we do work and actually we say, right, we need to do this. And actually sometimes we'll meet with the barriers in terms of actually, my current stewardship agreement says that I can't do that. So we've got to start to develop a bit more flexibility about how we can best utilize the value of those grazing livestock in terms of sequestering carbon, because all of this data provides that evidence that helps to empower farmers to be able to understand what can they do, what are those opportunities, which will help to inspire that change. And I think, yes, we're at the end. So yeah, I think we've hopefully got enough time to do some questions.
Well, thanks, Becky. That was a lot to get through. Well done on condensing, I guess, a lot of research and all that stuff in your head and work that's happened into that. There's been 9 questions so far,
Yep.
Some of which are around the data and some of which are around the management of the systems you're looking at. But there's a couple of really interesting questions in there I'd like to focus on first, particularly around, because we're thinking around getting ourselves to net zero. So obviously we want to sort of have a look at that and then get into the other questions. One of those things around it is about your carbon balance, your budget, as it were. So what carbon are you spending to save carbon later? So Daniel's got a good question here about how much carbon per hectare is used on average in the establishment of a new sward, he's put in brackets temporary grassland. Do you know that?
Yeah, so it will depend. It will depend in terms of method of establishment, all those other sorts of things. But you're basically dealing with carbon that's coming from diesel that you're burning, all those other bits that go into that. And we know that obviously when we're thinking about that sort of establishment method, we're mainly thinking about emissions that are coming from carbon dioxide. A figure off the top of my head as to what it would be. I couldn't tell you, to be totally honest, because it will depend. And that's the problem with a lot of this sort of thing, is it depends on, how it's established and those sorts of things. But if you think about, it's not going to be huge, but we're also, it'll be obviously slightly depending on the method of cultivation, but there are ways of doing that. And like I was sort of highlighting at the end there, there are some farmers that are having quite good success in terms of, thinking about rejuvenating pastures by stitching in new species and those sorts of things. It's just about making sure that you've got, you get rid of it, get rid of what's on the top to make sure that you've got a good, give it the best chance of success. But it will massively depend on the method of establishment. So apologies, I can't give you an exact number on that. But if you wanted to have a play with it, you could have a go on the calculator, which is obviously freely available, and put in different options, and you could see what that looks like.
Okay, thank you. Steve says, very interesting stuff. Have the findings been peer reviewed?
So we've done a range of different things. So all of the methodological stuff in terms of how that all goes through, that very much is in publication at the moment. So that's going through that peer review process. Obviously, there are, we've had the sort of the data analysis looked at to make sure that we've done it in a sensible way, and absolutely that has been the case. I suppose the challenge is that in terms of, because the sort of the research question has evolved over time from when we started. It's not like we've sort of done, right, we're gonna collect data for 3 years and we're going to do it. It's continually to evolve, so it doesn't sort of quite fit that sort of traditional peer review process. But what we have done is that all of the data that's fed into it is all being put into a sort of open source repository, so that it is there for researchers and whoever to look at, because the idea is that people get as much use out of this as possible. So we're just going through that process of anonymizing it and doing all that sort of stuff, so that there's the right data there for researchers to look at. But also it's done in a way which protects the farmers that are involved. But we're really keen that, as I say, it is used and sort of made the most of as much as possible, because that helps to move everybody forward. It's one of the things as well that we've really struggled with in the past, is that there's been lots of piecemeal experiments that have been done, that have all been done using slightly different methodologies, which means that actually when we then want to try and produce and develop this suite of evidence that we can then start to talk to policymakers with, actually it's not there. So we've always been very transparent and open with the methodology, and sort of said, come along and critique it, tell us what we've done wrong, but we're going to continue with that sort of to make sure that we've got that continuity, but also join in. So, come and do it in a way which means that we've then got that contiguous ability to keep building on this data set. And, we had to say, we work with a couple of other partners that have sort of got their own, are going out delivering their own soil sampling, but they're doing it to our protocol, so that again, that just continues to build the body of evidence and the data there that can look at, across different soil types and management systems.
Okay, thanks, Becky. Yeah, that sounds very transparent, like you say, about just being open, being accessible. Have you modified any of your methodology based on the basis of any critique you say you're having?
So we have, when we started off, I was, in terms of the soil health stuff, I was really keen that we were going to do a little bit more in terms of biological activity. So in year 1 and year 2, we were obviously doing worms, but we also decided that we were going to do the soil my undies one, where you plant pants. So we planted 10,000 pairs of pants across farms and across fields, and then we realised that actually in order to find them again was pretty challenging. So we don't do that anymore. We have got some of the fields where we have done a bit of additional testing, but that sort of that baseline methodology in terms of looking at soil carbon, soil organic matter at those different depths has stayed the same. We are doing some work at the moment, because one of the things that we are finding is that in terms of bulk density, what tends to happen in terms of moving to that calculation of carbon stock, you obviously need to take account of soil organic carbon percentage, you need to take account of bulk density and depth. What we are thinking is probably happening is for some of those fields, they're actually starting to build their soil in terms of the volume of their soil. So what we have started to do we've done it a little bit in terms of piloting it, and we're looking to roll it out more widely, is to actually start to understand that full depth of soil and how that's changing over time. So again, actually, where we potentially have got farms where they are starting to build their soil volume, which obviously we hadn't been testing at the start, because we weren't thinking that was gonna happen. But where we've got fields where potentially their bulk density is going down because their soils are becoming more fluffier, actually we're not capturing at the moment the fact that they might have built their total soil volume.
Thanks, Becky. I was pleased to put in the questions there. Many thanks. That's good. Thank you. Another question. It was a great presentation. This one's from Anna. Thanks, Becky. What are your thoughts on DEFRA's report on the harmonisation of carbon accounting tools?
Absolutely. So I think we really welcome because I think that one of the challenges that we have with carbon calculators, and often one of the pushbacks that we have from farmers where we engage with them in terms of doing their carbon calculation, is that, well, all of the calculators do completely different things and they tell you completely different results, and there's 755 of them out there and all the rest of it. And I think that what's important is that actually there is a role for DEFRA or whoever in terms of providing that approach and that standard that the calculators then adhere to. I think one of the key conclusions of that report, in terms of that harmonisation report, was that there isn't one set. It's difficult because there isn't one set standard. As I mentioned at the beginning, we've got some supermarkets or supply chains that are very much wanting to footprint past 2050. We've got that move and that transition over now more to the sort of science-based targets initiative. We've got GHG protocol. There are a range of different accounting methodologies which are out there, and so it does depend on what standard, and I think the harmonisation report picked that up nicely. I think what also is starting to happen, which is a really positive step forward, is that the calculators are now starting to work together more in terms of that methodology, because there shouldn't really, we're all dealing with the same numbers, it's just how we apply those numbers, and again which standards you then adhere to. So it should be a case that actually there is a lot more scope for that harmonisation between calculators in terms of the boring bit behind the scenes in terms of the methodology. So then as farmers you can then just choose whichever one you want. So we really welcome it, and again, like I was just saying with our sampling protocol, we are really open and transparent in terms of all the figures that go into the calculator. You can read all of our methodology. It gets, so again, I think the more that we can open the bonnet and shine a light as to how these calculators work to give farmers confidence, or to give whoever's using them confidence in the metrics, the better.
Thank you. I'm moving on to some of the other questions now about the data and what you've used. The questions are coming in thick and fast. I know you said you need to leave at 3:15. So any ones which are left over, you said kindly you'd look
Absolutely.
at for us. So
Yeah,
thank you
yeah.
very much, and we'll, I guess, send them out afterwards. So if you're asking a question, anyone, and you're not getting it answered, then hopefully we'll be able to pick that up in the next week with the video. Okay, so this one's from Bill and Ro. I'm going to put their questions together because it's about horticulture. So why does horticulture have the highest stock of soil carbon when it's continuously being cropped? From Bill. And Ro's interested to know, can you clarify what's included under horticulture?
Absolutely. So the fields that we've got on the soil carbon project data that went past, some of the it was probably a little bit of an unfair comparison, because what we tend to find is that with horticulture, a lot of the horticulture fields that we have potentially are under that no-dig system, so they're adding a large amount of organic matter to the top. So you tend to find that what happens is that you have quite a bonkers organic matter at the top, because they're continually applying carbon sources and compost and those sorts of things. So often the horticulture ones are a little bit of an anomaly, because there is that large level of inputs that are going in, whether that be from sources on the site, or whether that's from imported sources of organic matter that are coming on. And I know we've got a few. So for example, one of our research sites is one of the organic horticulture growers that is a stock-free system, so they are not using any any livestock products, but they're bringing in large quantities of wood chip from tree surgeons and those sorts of things. So there's a lot of imported organic matter coming in to continue to build that. So again, yeah, there is probably that the fields or the sites that we've got under that horticulture probably are not, well, I know they are not representative of field scale veg or any of those sorts of things. We have interestingly got some other sites where we are doing some of those testing where actually carbon is lost from those systems, and that is just built into the business model in terms of it's accepted that carbon is leaving that system because of the high level of cultivation.
Thank you, Becky. I was just unmuting myself. Thank you. Another question on your data was from Bill. Are the herbal lays versus PRG/WC figures statistically significant?
Yes, they are. Yeah, we've run the stats on them. So they are. And as I say, as part of that subset of, we've also got that other subset of farms where they've been doing, they've been doing implementing the diverse lays, and that's where that slide at the end around that 20% uplift, which is the conservative uplift from putting that diversity in.
Okay, thank you. A bit more about grazing now. Bill asks, does that grazing cutting split include fields that are mown and aftermath grazed?
No. So again, these were just ones that were zero graze. So that's what we pulled out in terms of, the ones which didn't have any animal impact on them. We could, again, I think these are all the questions where actually then being able to now divide them down in terms of ones which are predominantly silage but still have that grazing aftermath versus, as I say, the ones that we were pulling out where there was that significant difference was the ones that had no grazing activity on them at all, compared to ones which, again, may predominantly be grown for silage, but then have a little bit of grazing aftermath on them.
Okay, thank you. And then thinking about rotational grazing, Bill also asks, for how long was the rotational grazing trial done?
So that rotational grazing trial again it was part of that Yeo Valley stuff where we were doing that baseline and being able to see it. So they had been doing that rotational grazing for about 3.5 years. But again, we're looking forward to with that project because we've baselined everything. And then we're going to go back in year 6 and redo it all again. So that again will give us that ability to see what's happened over that time period. Because with those farms, we obviously started them where they were already doing whatever they were doing. So, but yeah, they've been doing it for about 3.5, 4 years.
Okay, thank you. And knowing now you've got about 10 minutes left, I'm just going to move over to some other questions now. This is another one. So Ian asks, can the toolkit be applied to non-farmed large areas such as parks and towns and so on? Or do you know if someone else is already doing it?
So we can use it, and we have done. So we've done a couple of projects for local authorities where we've done sort of their farm portfolio, but then we've also looked at amenity parklands or golf courses and all those sorts of things. So absolutely, it can be used. We are literally in the process of just going through the process of creating a version of it which is more for non-farmed areas, but it's still very much in early stages of development at the moment. So it can be used. You just have to do a little bit of there are obviously bits that don't apply and you can just turn those sections off. But we are, as I say, actively working on one at the moment, which means that the terminology will be in the right units and stuff for non-farmed land.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Steve now. Could the last year of FIPL funding pay for all farmers in the protected landscapes of Cumbria to have a Farm Carbon Toolkit baseline completed on their farms? And I guess what I'm really interested in that, you're not involved in the FIPL delivery, but what's your reflection on that question?
So we've done, farming protected landscape is brilliant, and we have done a lot of projects, where we've utilised FIPL funding to be able to support farmers. There's been a lot of work that's been done across all of those protected landscapes. What I would say is, the calculator is freely available for farmers to use. So it will never have a paywall for farmers. That's sort of part of our constitution. So again, it is there for farmers to use themselves. But what we tend to find is, when farmers are a bit time poor or they, don't have potentially it's not the top priority on their list, then having a bit of support and helping them understand what that looks like can be useful. And I think again that's worked really well in other areas. We've done, as I say, quite a lot working with the Farmer Network and with others to develop really good projects. But I think what you can also do is we're keen that the calculator is used. So the other thing that you can do, and we've done on other occasions, is to train local facilitators to use it and go out. So we're really keen that farmers just get empowered to understand how to use this and see this as an opportunity rather than a threat or a big stick that they're going to get hit with. By understanding, by having the data, by being proactive, you can actually start to have a very different conversation than potentially the one that you think you're going to be had. It doesn't have to be a negative. It doesn't have to be a you can't have any more livestock or any of those sorts of things. It does provide you with that information to see what's possible. And again, we're very happy to help support in whatever way that is provided. And again, whether that's we've also done soil sampling across through FIPL as well. So again, just giving farmers the information that they need and to then use that more widely in whatever form that might be.
It sounds like that sort of organising, facilitation, empowerment to get that evidence base, help to move forward, really important.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Claire asks, is your full methodology on the Soil Carbon Toolkit available on the website?
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah, it's all there. Again, in terms of what we test, but also my contact details if you would like to talk anything, if you'd like. We've also got a booklet. So we've got as part of the soil carbon project, what we developed was practical ways to measure soil carbon, and it goes through what we found from a methodological perspective. So again, it's broken down into 10 sections, which says, what's the best time to test, what analysis method should I use, how should I take the samples in a field, what are the different lab options, all those sorts of things. So yes, there's a sort of farmer friendly guide, but also all of the methodology is there as well.
Thank you, Becky. And from an anonymous attendee, does the use of grazing animals basically turn sequestered carbon into methane, or have I misunderstood their right?
So I think in terms of obviously, grazing animals and grazing animals contribution to that carbon cycle, obviously we know that what's happening is, those animals those animals are emitting methane. That methane is then broken down into it. So I think almost slightly the wrong way around, in terms of that methane is then broken down into its constituent parts in terms of carbon dioxide and water, and is then reabsorbed back into the system. So again, it's about understanding the longevity of that methane and then what happens to that methane. And what we know is that actually if those animals are out grazing or they are out at pasture, then there's emerging evidence in terms of the fact that there is a group of bacteria in terms of methanotrophic bacteria which actually live within the soil that will actually eat that methane as it's emitted from the animals and will actually again absorb that back into the system. So there's a lot, methane is very, very nuanced. Again, it has in the past been sort of thought about something which is very black and white, but we know that again there are inherent challenges in terms of the way that we account for methane and the potency of that methane and how long how many years we're attributing it for, but also then that wider role in terms of the fact that how the livestock have within those carbon nitrogen cycles, and actually really coming back to fundamentally what are we trying to achieve in terms of working with those carbon and nitrogen cycles and how we can use animals to the best of our ability to keep those going.
Thank you, Becky. Thank you. I know you've only got a few minutes left now, but all that's remaining are some really technical questions with numbers in from Bill. So I will start at the top. So is your figure of 5 million tonnes of annual carbon uptake? And sorry, I'll start again. Is that figure of 5 million tonnes of annual uptake of soil carbon for England, UK, or globally?
So that's for the UK, and that comes from their NFU Net Zero strategy. So that's what their estimations are in terms of in terms of what's possible.
Well, thank you. So you use that. Okay. So another question from Bill. 36 tonnes a hectare increase in soil organic carbon over 3.5 years would be about 10 tonnes a hectare a year at that rate of carbon uptake. Is his maths right there?
Yes, because what that's doing is obviously the difference between carbon and carbon dioxide equivalent. And we know that obviously we have to term, because we have emissions that are coming from carbon dioxide, and the carbon to carbon dioxide is that you basically times it by 3.67. So yes, your maths is right there.
Super. Thank you. Oh, one that's just snuck in. I think I'll get this one that's just snuck in, and then we'll say bye if that's okay. There are two from Bill, which I think perhaps we can just answer later after the call is finished, which aren't so technical. But this one's from James. You mentioned training facilitators. Has there been a similar things farmers need support with to engage with your net zero schemes? Training, looking to train people and support with that. So there's something perhaps we can follow up with there. But what's your experience of that training scheme?
Absolutely. And I think it comes down to the fact that absolutely, it's just seen as a bit of a scary subject. It's seen as something that isn't first and foremost. And actually, just by breaking carbon, carbon does not have to be this theoretical, highbrow thing. Actually, fundamentally, it comes down to how you're managing your farm, how you're dealing with those assets in terms of your livestock, your grassland, your soil, all those sorts of things. And actually, there is an economic benefit to thinking about these sort of things because you can save money. But there's also a positive story to be told there. And I think the biggest sort of barriers to break down is actually just around debunking some of the myths that farmers have around the fact that actually it's going to be a negative thing, helping them, empower them to understand that they are part of the positive story. And if we can do that, and then we can help them, support them in terms of developing the metrics, then we're absolutely onto a good thing.
Thanks, Becky. That sounds around using that environment, training and learning how to use it well, and being able to apply the evidence and data to be able to support the management you want to achieve in the future is all really important mix in it. Thanks very much for your time. Really appreciate it. There's one little phrase I'm going to take away from this afternoon, and that's the golden hoof. So thank you. I learned something.
No problem. And I'm sorry I've got to rush off. But again, if anybody's got any other questions, please do send them over.
Yeah, well, I'll send those two through from Bill for you.
Thank you.
Thanks again for your time. Really appreciate that, Becky. Thank you.
No worries. Thanks ever so much.
Bye now. So, thank you, Ian. Becky, I see that in the chat saying thanks to her too. The next part really was for us then to have a bit of conversation, perhaps through the chat, and maybe with Tim, who's come onto the line now, around what do we want to take from this afternoon's learning. What would be the key things you want to take away that you reckon we could use from Farm Carbon Toolkit to support our work? What is it you've done with us over the last 6 months in our farming land use sector group, working through up to get our action plan ready? What can Toolkit help us with? Are there any ideas? Unfortunately, this isn't like a Zoom meeting where we could put our hands up. So we're going to have to rely on the chat for this. It's going to have to be a bit different than usual. You reflect on, Tim.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I was just going to ask you if you'd mind me just popping in quickly.
Sure.
Just a couple of reflections from that was that was hugely positive and really engaging, and I think shows us that we can do this, and that it isn't quite as mysterious as maybe it's been in my mind. I think a few things to reflect on from the work of the sector group and the wider partnerships goal of net zero is that this should be about engaging our farmers and other people working on the land to really help them understand how they can contribute. And I think we know that this is a key part of the farming and land use sector group target to look at on-farm carbon emissions. I think it's quite exciting potentially that we can carry out some audits in the county potentially that through a sort of more consistent and trusted methodology that takes a bit of a standardized approach and builds that trust across landowners. I think it's really helpful as well to think about how we might better understand those NFU targets that Becky ran through and how that translates to the particular conditions and soil types and practices that we have in Cumbria, and start to build that picture a little bit through someone like Becky's support. So hopefully we can continue to do that both through the land use sector group, but also working across to some of the other partnerships like the Lake District National Park partnership, and also the work of the local nature partnership as well. So yeah, thanks for arranging this. It's been a very positive call.
I think it's all happened in the background with Robin and Bex and the others as well, Tim. I certainly learned a lot this afternoon. I think the biggest thing for me is around that, not support structure, but that sort of awareness around all of this. Like you say, it's demystified a lot for me. The things that I've also taken are around helping and supporting landowner and farming community around learning into this as well, around using it and having that evidence base to be able to then start to support, I guess, and the delivery of what we want to do in the county through the action plan. There's a couple of comments as well in webinar chat so far. Bill says perhaps we could use it to test the GWP star option. Is there something around that from the Farm Carbon Toolkit that we could perhaps explore? And Anna agrees that supporting farmers in Cumbria with doing greenhouse gas and carbon audits would be a good aim, whether helping them carry out a base learning or helping them with the understanding. That comes back to that awareness raising again, which seems really important from this afternoon. Andrew's talked there about how people are supporting farm carbon audits across protected landscapes, and AgriCalc is also popular. We've supported some of those through the football programme over the last 3 years. We've got one more year left of that until March 25. Rose also talking about working Becky and her team of Felford. It's been brilliant hand-holding by the Farmer Network, and having a trusted organisation to support farmers is crucial. The golden hoof, we should come back to that, or maybe even write it into the plan if we've got time before it goes out to the public, Tim. I don't know, but the golden hoof is certainly something that I think we could hook something around. It's those sort of tangible, interesting, novel phrases like that, I think, that start to engage people. It could be a way in which we do that. It's a great story to tell. Ro goes on to capture how management is so important, very positive approach and data to share, and linking this to food production, vegetables, herbal and meat and dairy. If we don't produce our food here, then it must be imported. We need to manage what we have to our best ability, and I totally agree about that. It's about that just transition. How do you support everyone and do it together kindly, respectfully, to get where we need to be, is what I'd add to that. I think having this evidence from things like the Farm Carbon Toolkit can really play a good part, a critical part in that. One new message. Bill says the results show the benefit of who's on the ground here. Yeah, I'd agree. Is there anything from the other panelists on the background of the webinar, people you can see on the screen? Anything to add, anything you want to contribute, or should we start thinking about wrapping that up? What do you think, Tim?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, Tim, that's been a really positive call, as I say, and I think any outstanding questions, feel free to divert to us through the ZCCP partnership website. Please, if you've got any further questions to add just in the last few minutes, do so, and I'm sure we can share those with Becky and any other thoughts that we can pick up once the call's finished. So yeah, thank you very much to everyone that's contributed to making the session happen, and particular thanks to you, Tim, as well, for so ably chairing us through the discussion. Much appreciated.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. We got through about 18 questions, left 2 out at the end before Becky had to go home. Also, she was home, I think, but leave the session. So we did well on that. But yes, if there's anything extra that you want to ask us, please feel free to. And one of us or Becky will pick that up in the next week. And I guess we'll send the link around next with that for today's recording once we've edited it a little bit, I guess. Yeah, the end, chop the ends off. Well, okay. Thanks, Ro's going now, and Neil's just added, before I finish up, further explanation of land management impacts on carbon stores, diverse spores and so forth, the benefits of right agricultural management, engaged farming and audience that way that Treat and Peace struggles to. So there's a reflection there about how to engage into that. Thank you, Bill, for your kind comments there. I think I'll leave it there then, and thank everyone for your time this afternoon. That's been a great experience, really positive, and I guess I'll see those colleagues next in a couple of weeks on the 26th of February. We're meeting next at Merley Moss again, Wayfaring House at the Lake District National Park offices for our next farming land use sector group. Thanks, everyone. I'll say bye at that time. Bye now.